The moment I saw the fluorescent orange violation notice taped to my front door, I knew my peaceful Tuesday morning was about to go straight to hell. I had just pulled into my driveway in my Ford F-250, still covered in mud from the commercial excavation job I had been working on since 5 that morning in Henderson, Nevada. My name is Steven Hartley, and I own a small construction company that specializes in foundation work and land clearing. The backhoe sitting on my property was not just some toy or vanity project. It was my livelihood, the machine that put food on my table and paid the mortgage on this house in the Willow Creek subdivision outside Las Vegas. The notice was printed on official HOA letterhead, complete with a ridiculous logo featuring a willow tree and what looked like a creek that probably never existed in the Nevada desert. I ripped it off the door and read the words that would change everything. Violation notice. Unapproved commercial vehicle storage on residential property. Fine, $500. Daily accumulation of $250 until violation is corrected. Contact the HOA board immediately. $500 for parking my backhoe on my own property. The machine was not even visible from the street. I had specifically positioned it behind my house, near the back fence that bordered the community park area. The only way someone could have seen it was if they deliberately walked around to the back of my property or used binoculars from the park. I crumpled the notice in my fist and walked inside, tossing my work gloves onto the kitchen counter. My golden retriever, Bear, came bounding over, and I scratched behind his ears while I pulled out my phone. The HOA contact number was listed at the bottom of the violation notice, and I dialed it immediately. Willow Creek Homeowners Association, this is Brenda speaking. Yeah, hi, my name is Steven Hartley. I just found a violation notice on my door about my backhoe, and I need to speak to someone about this immediately. Let me transfer you to our board president, Patricia Morrison. The hold music was some generic piano melody that made my blood pressure rise even higher. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes, a sharp voice came on the line. This is Patricia Morrison. I assume you are calling about your commercial vehicle violation. I am calling about the ridiculous fine you slapped on my door, yes. That backhoe is my work equipment. I run a construction company. Where exactly am I supposed to keep it? Mr. Hartley, the covenants, codes, and restrictions for Willow Creek are very clear. Section 12, Paragraph 4 explicitly states that no commercial vehicles or equipment may be stored on residential properties. This includes but is not limited to delivery trucks, trailers, and construction equipment. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. Patricia, I read those covenants before I bought this house 3 years ago. There was nothing in there about backhoes or construction equipment. I specifically checked because I knew I would need to keep my equipment somewhere secure. The covenants were updated 6 months ago at the annual meeting. All homeowners received copies via mail. I never received any updated covenants. That is not our problem, Mr. Hartley. Ignorance of the rules does not exempt you from following them. You have 72 hours to remove the equipment, or the daily fines will begin accumulating. Have a nice day. She hung up before I could respond. I stood there in my kitchen, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone and feeling my anger build like pressure in a boiler. Bear looked up at me with concerned eyes, sensing my mood. I spent the next hour going through every piece of mail I had received in the past 6 months. Nothing. Not a single envelope from the HOA with updated covenants. I checked my email, my spam folder, everything. There was no record of them ever sending me any updated rules. The backhoe in question was a John Deere 310 SL, worth about $90,000. It was not something I could just park on the street or leave at a random storage facility without serious security concerns. Equipment theft was a real problem in the Las Vegas area, and I had already had tools stolen from job sites twice in the past year. I decided to drive over to the HOA office, which was located in a small building near the subdivision entrance. The Willow Creek development was one of those master-planned communities that had sprung up in the early 2000s, featuring cookie-cutter stucco houses painted in various shades of beige and tan. The HOA office was in a separate building that also housed a small gym and a meeting room. Patricia Morrison was exactly what I expected. She looked to be in her mid-50s, with a short blonde bob that was styled so stiffly it probably would not move in a hurricane. She wore a pantsuit in an aggressive shade of burgundy and had reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Her nameplate sat prominently on her desk, and the office walls were covered in framed certificates and photos of her at various HOA conferences. "Mr. Hartley, I was not expecting you to come by in person." "Well, Patricia, when someone fines me $500 for parking my work equipment on my own property, I tend to want to have a face-to-face conversation about it." She gestured to a chair across from her desk, and I sat down, though every muscle in my body was tense with frustration. "Let me be very clear," she began, folding her hands on the desk in front of her. "The Willow Creek HOA takes our covenants seriously. We work very hard to maintain property values and the aesthetic appeal of this community. Commercial vehicles and equipment are an eyesore and negatively impact everyone's investment. My backhoe is behind my house. You cannot see it from the street. The only way you could have seen it is if you were deliberately snooping around my property. We received a complaint from a concerned neighbor. Who? That information is confidential." I leaned forward. "Let me get this straight. Someone complained about equipment they could only see if they were trespassing on my property, and now you are fining me $500 plus $250 a day. Do you understand how insane that sounds?" Patricia's expression did not change. "Mr. Hartley, your tone is becoming aggressive, and I will not tolerate disrespect. The rules are the rules. If you do not like them, you are free to sell your home and move somewhere else." That sentence, those exact words, they are what pushed me from angry to absolutely furious. This woman was telling me to sell my home, to uproot my life, because of her petty power trip. "Show me the updated covenants," I said, keeping my voice level with effort. "Show me proof that these were mailed to all homeowners." She turned to her computer and clicked around for a moment, then pulled up a document. "Here is the sign-in sheet from the annual meeting where the changes were voted on. We had 37 homeowners in attendance out of 212 homes. The vote passed 28-9. I was not at that meeting because I was never notified about it. The meeting notice was sent out 30 days in advance, as required by Nevada law. I never received it." Patricia gave me a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. "Again, that is not our responsibility. Perhaps you should check with your postal carrier." I stood up, knowing that continuing this conversation was pointless. "I will be speaking with a lawyer." "That is your right, Mr. Hartley, but the fine stands and it will continue to accumulate until you comply with the covenants. Good day." I left the office and sat in my truck for a solid 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel and trying to calm down. The rational part of my brain knew that getting a lawyer involved was the right move. The irrational part, the part that had been working since dawn and was exhausted and frustrated, wanted to do something much more dramatic. Over the next 2 days, I did try to do things the right way. I called 3 different attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes. The first one told me that fighting HOA violations was expensive and time-consuming, and I would probably spend more on legal fees than I would just paying the fine and moving the backhoe. The second attorney said basically the same thing. The third one agreed to take my case but wanted a $5,000 retainer just to start. Meanwhile, the 72-hour deadline came and went. True to her word, Patricia sent me another notice, this time informing me that I now owed $750 and the daily fines would continue. I tried calling the HOA board members whose names were listed on the website. Out of 6 board members, only 2 returned my calls. One of them, a guy named Richard, seemed sympathetic but said his hands were tied because Patricia ran the board with an iron fist, and any dissent was immediately shut down. The other board member, a woman named Susan, told me I should just follow the rules and stop making trouble. By day 5, I owed $1,500. My backhoe was still sitting behind my house, and I was running out of options. I had jobs lined up that required that specific machine. Moving it to a storage facility would cost money I did not have budgeted, and I had already checked every facility within a reasonable distance. None of them had indoor storage available, which meant my $90,000 machine would be sitting in an open lot somewhere, vulnerable to theft and weather damage. That Friday evening, I was sitting on my back patio with a beer, staring at the backhoe and the fence that separated my property from the HOA community park. The fence was one of those standard 6-foot wooden privacy fences, painted a tasteful tan color that matched everything else in this planned community nightmare. Bear was lying at my feet, and I was scratching his head absently when the idea formed. It was a terrible idea. It was probably illegal. It would definitely make my situation worse. But something about the sheer injustice of the whole thing had pushed me past caring about consequences. The fence was HOA property. Patricia had made that very clear in one of her many condescending emails. The community park was HOA property. The little playground and the walking path and the decorative rocks that probably cost more than my truck were all HOA property, maintained by HOA dues that I paid every month without complaint. If I was going to be fined into oblivion for storing my backhoe on my property, maybe it was time to move it off my property. Specifically, through the HOA fence and onto their precious community park. I know how insane that sounds. I know that destroying property is not the answer to a legal dispute. But after 5 days of being treated like a criminal for trying to make a living, after being told to sell my house and move, after being fined thousands of dollars for parking my work equipment behind my house where nobody could even see it, I had reached my breaking point. Saturday morning, I woke up early and walked around the property, examining the fence line. The backhoe was positioned about 15 feet from the fence. It would be easy enough to start it up, drive forward, and punch right through those wooden panels. The fence was not designed to withstand that kind of force. It would splinter like toothpicks. I spent most of the morning talking myself out of it. I called my brother, Marcus, who lived in Phoenix and had always been the voice of reason in our family. "Steve, do not do this," he said when I explained my plan. "You will get arrested, you will get sued. This is not worth it." "I am already being fined into oblivion, Marcus. What difference does it make at this point? The difference is that right now you have a case. You can argue that you were not properly notified about the rule changes, but if you deliberately destroy their property, you are giving them ammunition. Please, just find a storage unit and move the equipment." I told him I would think about it and hung up. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Why should I be the one to back down? Why should I spend hundreds of dollars a month on storage because Patricia Morrison decided to go on a power trip? Why should I have to uproot my business operations because some HOA board decided to change the rules without properly notifying everyone? By Saturday afternoon, I had made my decision. I was going to drive the backhoe through their fence. Not because it would solve anything, but because it would make a point. They wanted to fine me for having the backhoe on my property. Fine. I would remove it from my property in the most dramatic way possible. I waited until Sunday morning. Sundays in Willow Creek were quiet, with most people sleeping in or having family time. The community park would be mostly empty. I was not trying to hurt anyone or cause a public scene. I just wanted to make my point and deal with whatever consequences came after. At 7 o'clock on Sunday morning, I walked out to the backhoe with Bear trailing behind me. I climbed into the operator's seat, inserted the key, and started the engine. The diesel motor rumbled to life, and I felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with anger and satisfaction. The machine was facing away from the fence, so I had to maneuver it around. The bucket arm was raised, and I positioned the backhoe so it was aimed directly at the section of fence behind my property. The wooden panels looked flimsy and insignificant compared to the 10-ton machine I was controlling. I sat there for a moment, hands on the controls, giving myself one last chance to back out. This was insane. This was going to cause me so many problems. But then I thought about Patricia's smug face, about the mounting fines, about being told to sell my house, and I pushed the throttle forward. The backhoe rolled across my yard, picking up speed. The fence did not stand a chance. The machine hit the wooden panels with a splintering crash that was incredibly satisfying. Wood flew in every direction, and I kept driving forward onto the community park property, knocking down 20 feet of fence like it was made of cardboard. I drove the backhoe about 50 feet into the park, then parked it right in the middle of the walking path. I turned off the engine, climbed down, and stood there looking at the destruction I had just caused. The fence was obliterated. Wooden panels and posts were scattered across my yard and the park. The backhoe sat there like a yellow monument to my frustration. Bear had followed me through the gap in the fence and was sniffing around the debris with interest. I pulled out my phone and took several photos, documenting everything. If I was going to do something this crazy, I might as well have proof. I did not have to wait long for the response. Within 20 minutes, I saw Patricia Morrison's silver Mercedes pull up to the park entrance. She got out of her car, dressed in what looked like church clothes, and stood there staring at the destroyed fence and the backhoe sitting in the middle of the community park. I walked over to meet her, hands in my pockets, trying to look as calm as possible even though my heart was racing. "Good morning, Patricia." Her face was red, and she looked like she was about to explode. "What have you done? What in God's name have you done?" I removed the backhoe from my property as requested. "You said I was not allowed to store commercial equipment on residential property." "Well, it is not on residential property anymore. It is on HOA property now, community property. I pay dues for this park, so technically, I have just as much right to use it as anyone else. You destroyed the fence. You will be hearing from our lawyers, Mr. Hartley. You will be paying for every cent of damage, and I will make sure you are fined until you lose this house. Actually, Patricia, I think you should be careful about making threats. I have documented evidence that I was never properly notified about the covenant changes. I have documented evidence that your notices were not sent to my address. And I have witnesses who can testify that you have been harassing me over equipment that was not visible from any public area. So before you start talking about lawyers, Maybe you should think about what a judge might say about your improper notification procedures." That was mostly a bluff. I did not actually have proof that the notices were not sent, only proof that I never received them. But I was banking on Patricia not knowing the difference. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, and then she pulled out her phone. "I am calling the police. You have committed vandalism and property destruction. Go ahead." I will be happy to explain to the police why I was forced to take this action after being illegally fined by an HOA board that did not follow proper notification procedures. She did call the police. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, watching her pace back and forth while she spoke to the dispatcher. More neighbors started appearing, drawn by the commotion. I recognized some of them from around the subdivision, though I did not know their names. They stood at a distance, whispering and pointing at the destroyed fence and the backhoe. 2 police cars arrived about 15 minutes later. The officers got out and surveyed the damage, and one of them walked over to me. "Sir, I am Officer Davis with the Henderson Police Department. Can you explain what happened here?" I took a deep breath and told him everything. I explained about the violation notice, the fines, the lack of proper notification about covenant changes, and Patricia's refusal to work with me on any kind of resolution. I explained that I had been backed into a corner and had made a poor decision out of frustration, but that I was willing to take responsibility for my actions. Officer Davis listened without interrupting, taking notes on a small pad. Then he walked over to Patricia, who immediately launched into her own version of events, waving her arms and pointing at me accusingly. The officers conferred for a few minutes, and then Officer Davis came back to me. "Mr. Hartley, I understand your frustration with the HOA situation, but you cannot destroy property just because you are angry. That is textbook vandalism. I am going to have to write you a citation, and the HOA will likely pursue civil action against you for the damages." "I understand, officer. I know what I did was wrong. I just wanted to make a point." He wrote up the citation, which carried a $500 fine and required me to appear in court. Patricia looked triumphant as she watched this happen, and I could practically see her mentally calculating all the additional fines and fees she would be adding to my account. But then something unexpected happened. One of the neighbors who had been watching the whole scene walked over to the officers. "Excuse me, officer. I am Robert Chen, and I live 3 houses down from Mr. Hartley. I am on the HOA board, though I was not consulted about any of this enforcement action. I think there might be some information you should know." Patricia's expression changed from triumph to concern. "Robert, this is not the time." "Actually, Patricia, I think it is exactly the time. I have been trying to bring up concerns about your management style at board meetings for months, and you have shut me down every time. But this has gone too far." Officer Davis looked interested. "What kind of concerns, Mr. Chen?" Robert pulled out his phone and started scrolling through emails. "Patricia has been sending violation notices to homeowners without board approval. She changed our enforcement procedures without a vote. And I have serious doubts about whether proper notification was sent out regarding the covenant changes. I never received updated covenants in the mail, and when I asked about it at the last board meeting, Patricia said they were only sent to people who attended the annual meeting." That got the officers' attention. Patricia started protesting, but Robert kept talking. "Nevada law requires HOAs to send written notice of covenant changes to all homeowners, not just those who attend meetings. If Mr. Hartley never received that notification, then these fines are not legally enforceable." Officer Davis looked at Patricia. "Madam, is this true? Did you send notification to all homeowners?" Patricia's face was getting redder by the second. We posted the changes on the community website and sent emails to everyone on our contact list. But did you send physical mail? Robert pressed. Because our covenants specifically state that official notifications must be sent via postal mail to the address of record. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia did not answer, which was answer enough. Officer Davis sighed and closed his citation book. This is getting complicated. Mr. Hartley, you are still responsible for the property damage, but I am going to recommend that both parties seek legal mediation before this goes any further. Madam, if you did not follow proper notification procedures, then you may have bigger problems than a broken fence. Patricia looked like she had swallowed a lemon. More neighbors had gathered now, and several of them were nodding along with what Robert was saying. It seemed I was not the only one who had issues with Patricia's management style. One woman, elderly with silver hair, stepped forward. I never received any updated covenants either. Patricia sent me a violation notice last month because I planted roses in my front yard without approval, but I had no idea I needed approval. This whole board has become ridiculous. Another man chimed in. I got fined for parking my work van in my driveway overnight. I am a plumber. How am I supposed to do my job without my van? It was like opening floodgates. Once people started speaking up, more and more complaints came out. Patricia had apparently been on a violation spree for months, finding reasons to fine people for the smallest infractions. And from what everyone was saying, most of these violations were based on rules that had been changed without proper notification. Officer Davis held up his hands. Folks, I appreciate all the information, but this is a civil matter. You all need to handle this through your HOA board meetings or through the courts. Mr. Hartley, I am still writing you this citation for the property damage, but I strongly suggest you document everything and consult with an attorney. This whole situation is a mess. After the police left, I stood in my backyard surrounded by broken fence pieces and angry neighbors. Robert came over to talk to me privately. Steve, I am really sorry about all of this. I have been trying to rein in Patricia for months, but she has 3 other board members who just go along with whatever she says. I think what you did today, as crazy as it was, might actually help. This has gotten enough attention that we might finally be able to force a special board meeting and address these issues properly. Thanks, Robert. I appreciate you speaking up. I know what I did was stupid, but I just could not take it anymore. I get it. Trust me, I get it. Can I get your phone number? I am going to start organizing some of the other homeowners. I think there are enough people who are fed up with Patricia's management that we might be able to vote her out. I gave him my number, and we exchanged information. As people started drifting away, I looked at the destroyed fence and the backhoe still sitting in the middle of the park. I needed to figure out what to do next, but at least I was not alone anymore. That afternoon, I got a call from a local news station. Apparently, someone had posted photos of the backhoe in the community park on social media, and it had started going viral. The reporter wanted to interview me about the HOA dispute. At first, I was hesitant. Drawing more attention to this situation seemed like a bad idea. But then, I thought about Patricia's smug face and decided that maybe public pressure was exactly what this situation needed. The news crew arrived that evening. They filmed the damaged fence, the backhoe still sitting in the park, and interviewed me about the whole situation. I explained everything as calmly as I could, focusing on the lack of notification and the unreasonable fines. The reporter also interviewed several of my neighbors who shared their own stories of Patricia's overzealous enforcement. The story aired on the 10 o'clock news that night. I watched it with a mixture of pride and anxiety. They had titled it, HOA Gone Too Far. Local contractor destroys fence after dispute over work equipment. It was actually pretty balanced reporting, highlighting both my destruction of property and the apparent issues with the HOA's notification procedures. The story got picked up by other local news outlets, and by Monday morning, my phone was ringing off the hook. News stations from Las Vegas proper wanted to do follow-up stories. A lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes called me and offered to take my case pro bono because he thought it would be good publicity. Several construction workers and contractors from around the area reached out to tell me similar stories about HOA disputes, but the most important call came from the Nevada Real Estate Division. They were the state agency that oversaw HOA compliance with state law, and they had seen the news coverage. They wanted to investigate whether Willow Creek HOA had violated proper notification requirements for the covenant changes. An investigator named Janet Reeves came to my house on Tuesday morning. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who carried a thick folder of paperwork and had clearly dealt with HOA disputes before. "Mr. Hartley, I have been reviewing the covenants for Willow Creek, and I have some concerns about the procedures that were followed. Can you show me all the documentation you have regarding this dispute?" I showed her everything. The original violation notice, the follow-up notices, the emails from Patricia, and my own documentation showing that I had never received any updated covenants or notification about the annual meeting where the changes were supposedly voted on. Janet took notes and made copies of everything. I am going to need to interview the HOA board as well. Based on what I am seeing here, there are some serious compliance issues. Nevada law is very specific about notification requirements, and HOAs cannot just post changes on a website or send emails. They have to send certified mail or first-class mail to all homeowners of record. That is what I thought, but Patricia kept insisting that I should have known about the changes. Ignorance of the law is not a defense, but that works both ways. The HOA board has an obligation to follow the law, and if they did not, then any enforcement actions taken based on those covenant changes are invalid. Over the next week, things moved quickly. Janet interviewed Patricia and the other board members. She requested copies of all mailing receipts proving that notifications had been sent to every homeowner. When Patricia could not produce those receipts, claiming they had been lost or misplaced, Janet expanded her investigation. It turned out that Patricia had been cutting corners on notifications for years. She had been sending emails instead of physical mail because it was cheaper and easier, even though the HOA covenants specifically required physical mail for official notifications. The annual meeting where the covenant changes were voted on had only been advertised via email and a small notice on the community website, which many homeowners did not even know existed. Robert and several other fed-up homeowners organized a special meeting to address Patricia's management. The meeting was held in the community center, and over 100 homeowners showed up. The room was packed with angry people who had been fined, harassed, or intimidated by Patricia's enforcement tactics. I attended the meeting, sitting in the back row and trying to stay inconspicuous. But when Robert asked if anyone wanted to share their experiences, I stood up and told my story. I explained about the backhoe, the fines, the lack of notification, and yes, my admittedly stupid decision to drive through their fence. "I know what I did was wrong," I said to the room full of neighbors. "I should not have destroyed property. But I want you all to understand how frustrating it is to be told you are breaking rules that you did not even know existed. I bought my house in good faith. I read the covenants before I signed the papers. Nowhere did it say that I could not keep my work equipment on my property, And when Patricia changed those rules without telling anyone, she put my entire livelihood at risk. The room erupted in applause. Other people stood up and shared similar stories. The plumber who had been fined for his work van, the woman who had been fined for planting roses, a young couple who had been fined for having their garbage cans visible from the street for more than 2 hours, an elderly man who had been fined for having weeds in his rock garden, even though they were actually native desert plants that he was cultivating intentionally. Story after story poured out, painting a picture of an HOA board that had gone completely off the rails under Patricia's leadership. By the end of the meeting, a vote was called to remove Patricia Morrison from the board. The vote was nearly unanimous, with only 3 people voting against removal. Patricia sat in the front row, her face pale, as the results were announced. She was officially removed from her position as board president, effective immediately. Robert was voted in as the new president, and he immediately made some announcements. First, we are going to conduct a complete review of all violation notices that have been issued in the past year. Any violations based on covenant changes that were not properly noticed are going to be voided, and any fines will be refunded. Second, we are going to hire a professional management company to handle our HOA operations, because clearly we need better oversight and proper legal compliance. Third, I want to personally apologize to Steve Hartley and everyone else who has been unfairly targeted by overzealous enforcement. More applause. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I had not even realized was there, but the story did not end there. 2 days later, Janet Reeves from the Real Estate Division called me with an update. Mr. Hartley, I wanted to let you know that our investigation has uncovered some serious issues with the Willow Creek HOA. Patricia Morrison has been embezzling money from the HOA Reserve Fund. We found discrepancies in the financial records going back 2 years. We are turning this over to the Clark County District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. Are you serious? Completely serious. It looks like she was using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, including a luxury vacation to Hawaii and a new car. The total amount embezzled is over $40,000. This is a felony. Within a week, Patricia Morrison was arrested. The news coverage was extensive, with reporters detailing how the former HOA president had abused her position and stolen from the community she was supposed to serve. The irony was not lost on anyone that she had been so focused on enforcing petty violations while committing actual crimes herself. The criminal case moved forward, and I was called to testify about the HOA dispute that had led to the investigation. I told the court about the violation notices, the fines, and my ill-advised decision to destroy the fence. The prosecutor used my testimony to establish a pattern of Patricia's authoritarian behavior and lack of accountability. Patricia Morrison was ultimately convicted of embezzlement and abuse of authority. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay back the full amount she had stolen, plus penalties. The judge was particularly harsh in his sentencing remarks, noting that she had betrayed the trust of her entire community for personal gain. As for me, I still had to deal with the consequences of my fence destruction. The new HOA board decided not to pursue civil damages against me, recognizing that I had been unfairly targeted and that my actions, while wrong, had ultimately exposed serious corruption. However, I still had to pay the $500 citation from the police for vandalism, and I agreed to repair the section of fence I had destroyed. I spent a weekend rebuilding that fence, and several of my neighbors came out to help. We worked together, replacing the broken panels and posts and it became a kind of community bonding experience. People brought lemonade and snacks, and we talked and joked while we worked. It was the most connected I had felt to my neighborhood since moving in. The Backhoe, which had been sitting in the community park for 2 weeks during all the investigations and meetings, was finally moved to a proper storage facility. The new HOA board had agreed to reimburse me for 3 months of storage fees as compensation for the improper violation notices. It was not much, but it was a gesture of goodwill that I appreciated. Robert, as the new board president, implemented a lot of changes. They established a formal appeals process for violations, required multiple board members to approve any fines over $100, and instituted regular financial audits to prevent future embezzlement. They also revised the covenant change procedures to ensure proper notification was always sent via certified mail to every homeowner. The story got picked up by national news outlets as an example of HOA overreach and corruption. I did a few more interviews, and I became something of an accidental advocate for HOA reform. I joined online forums and support groups for people dealing with HOA disputes, sharing my experience and encouraging others to stand up for their rights. My construction business actually benefited from all the publicity. Contractors and homeowners around the Las Vegas area started calling me for work, saying they wanted to support someone who had stood up to an abusive HOA. My schedule filled up quickly, and I had to hire 2 additional employees to keep up with demand. About 6 months after the fence incident, I was working on a foundation job in North Las Vegas when I got a call from my lawyer, the one who had taken my case pro bono after seeing the news coverage. "Steve, I have got some interesting news. The Willow Creek HOA board wants to meet with you. They have a proposal." I was skeptical, but I agreed to meet with Robert and the other new board members. We met at a coffee shop in Henderson, neutral territory away from the subdivision. "Steve, we have been talking as a board and we want to propose something," Robert began. "We need someone with your experience and perspective on the board. You understand what it is like to be on the receiving end of unfair enforcement, and you have shown that you are willing to fight for what is right, even when it costs you personally. Would you consider joining the HOA board?" I was stunned. "You want me on the board?" "After I drove a backhoe through your fence," one of the other board members, a woman named Lisa, laughed. "Especially because you drove a backhoe through our fence. We need people who are not afraid to challenge bad policies and stand up to abuse of power. You did that in probably the most dramatic way possible. But the end result was that you exposed corruption and helped reform our community. We need that kind of courage on the board." I thought about it for a long moment. The idea of voluntarily joining an HOA board after everything I had been through seemed insane. But then, I thought about all the other homeowners who had been unfairly targeted, about the elderly woman with her roses and the plumber with his work van. If I could help prevent that kind of abuse from happening again, maybe it would be worth it. "Okay," I said. "I will do it, but I have some conditions. First, we establish clear guidelines for what constitutes a legitimate violation. Second, we implement a 3-strike warning system before any fines are issued. Third, we commit to transparency in all board decisions, with meeting minutes posted publicly within 48 hours. Robert nodded, writing down my conditions. "All of that sounds reasonable. We can present it to the full board for a vote." I joined the Willow Creek HOA board in the fall. It was a strange experience, sitting in those meeting rooms and discussing community issues from the other side of the table. But I approached it with the perspective of someone who had been unfairly targeted, and I made sure that every decision we made prioritized fairness and due process. We implemented all of my proposed changes, plus several others. We established a community fund to help homeowners who were struggling financially and could not afford to immediately fix legitimate violations. We created a volunteer committee to help elderly residents with yard maintenance so they would not get violation notices for things they physically could not do. We revised the architectural review process to be more reasonable and responsive. The transformation of Willow Creek was gradual but noticeable. People started actually enjoying living in the community instead of living in fear of violation notices. The community park, where my backhoe had sat as a symbol of my rebellion, became a popular gathering place. We organized movie nights and holiday parties there. The fence I had destroyed and then rebuilt became a kind of inside joke in the neighborhood, with people occasionally joking about the backhoe incident. Patricia Morrison served 2 years of her 3-year sentence before being released on parole. I heard through the grapevine that she moved to Arizona to live with her sister and was working as a receptionist at a dental office. I did not feel particularly vindictive about her imprisonment. In a way, I felt sorry for her. She had let a small amount of power go to her head, and it had destroyed her life. The legal and financial consequences of my fence destruction ended up being minimal. I paid the $500 citation, spent about $300 on materials to rebuild the fence, and lost a weekend of my time. Compared to what could have happened, I got off easy. If the investigation had not uncovered Patricia's embezzlement, I probably would have been sued for thousands of dollars in damages and faced much more serious consequences. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had not driven that backhoe through the fence. Would Patricia's corruption ever have been discovered? Would all those homeowners still be getting harassed with petty violation notices? Would I still be fighting an uphill battle against mounting fines and an unresponsive board? I do not regret what I did, even though I know it was wrong. Sometimes, when systems fail and authority is abused, it takes a dramatic action to expose the truth and force change. I would not recommend property destruction as a problem-solving technique, but in my specific situation, it worked out. My brother Marcus, the voice of reason who had tried to talk me out of it, eventually came to visit and see the rebuilt fence for himself. "I cannot believe you got away with this," he said, shaking his head. "You should have been sued into oblivion." "I know. But sometimes the universe works in mysterious ways. Or sometimes you just get really, really lucky." He was probably right. Luck had definitely played a role if Robert had not been on the HOA board and spoken up to the police. If Janet from the real estate division had not been diligent in her investigation. If Patricia had not been embezzling funds. Any one of those factors could have gone differently, and I would be in a much worse situation. But I also think there was something more than luck at play. There was a whole community of people who were fed up with being pushed around and were ready for change. My backhoe through the fence was just the spark that ignited that existing frustration. A year after the incident, the Willow Creek HOA threw a community appreciation barbecue in the park. Robert gave a speech thanking everyone who had contributed to the positive changes in our community, and to my embarrassment, he specifically mentioned me. I know Steve would probably prefer not to be singled out, but I think we all owe him a debt of gratitude. His willingness to stand up against unfair treatment, even at personal cost, helped expose serious problems in our community, and his continued service on the board has helped us implement real reforms. So, let us give Steve a round of applause. The whole park erupted in applause and cheers. People came up to shake my hand and thank me. It was overwhelming and touching and made me feel like maybe, just maybe, my crazy decision had been worth it. Bear, who had become something of a neighborhood celebrity himself, got plenty of attention and treats from everyone. He was living his best life, completely unaware of the drama and legal complications his human had caused. As I stood there in the community park, eating a burger and watching neighbors laugh and talk and enjoy themselves, I thought about how different things could have been. If Patricia had just been reasonable, if she had worked with me instead of against me, if she had focused on actually serving the community instead of wielding power over it. But she did not, and I drove a backhoe through a fence, and somehow it all worked out. Not despite the conflict, but because of it. Sometimes you have to break things down to build them back up better. Sometimes you have to make a dramatic gesture to get people's attention and force change. I am not saying everyone should go out and destroy property when they are frustrated with their HOA. That is terrible advice, and I am lucky I did not face more serious consequences. But I am saying that standing up for yourself matters. Refusing to accept unfair treatment matters. Being willing to fight, even when it is scary and uncertain, matters. The Backhoe incident became local legend in the Las Vegas contractor community. Other construction workers would introduce me as the guy who drove through the HOA fence, and it always got a laugh and knowing nods. Everyone in my industry had HOA horror stories, and mine had just been more dramatic than most. My business continued to thrive. The publicity had been better than any advertising I could have paid for, and I built a reputation as someone who was honest, hardworking, and willing to stand up for what was right. Clients trusted me, and word-of-mouth referrals kept me busier than I had ever been. I even got a call from a television producer who wanted to do a documentary series about HOA disputes across America. They wanted to feature my story as one of the episodes. I politely declined, figuring I had gotten enough media attention to last a lifetime. But the fact that someone wanted to make a documentary about HOAs gone wrong just confirmed what I had always suspected. This was not just my problem. It was a widespread issue affecting communities all across the country. 2 years after the fence incident, I was still on the Willow Creek HOA board. We had successfully implemented most of the reforms we had planned, and the community was thriving. Property values had actually increased, which was ironic considering Patricia's claim that my backhoe was going to destroy property values. Turns out, people are willing to pay more to live in a community where they are treated fairly and with respect. I kept that backhoe, of course. It was still the primary machine for my business, still worth about $90,000, still essential to my livelihood. But now it was safely stored in a secure facility, and I had peace of mind knowing that I would not wake up to violation notices on my door. Sometimes, when I am operating that backhoe on a job site, I think about that Sunday morning when I drove it through the fence. The sound of splintering wood, the feeling of satisfaction mixed with fear, the moment when I knew I had crossed a line but could not bring myself to care. I would not say I am proud of what I did. Destruction of property is never something to be proud of, but I am proud that I stood up for myself. I am proud that I refused to be bullied into submission. I am proud that my actions, however misguided, led to positive change for my entire community. And I am grateful. Grateful for neighbors like Robert who had the courage to speak up. Grateful for investigators like Janet who did their jobs thoroughly. Grateful for a legal system that, despite its flaws, ultimately held Patricia accountable for her crimes. Grateful for a community that rallied together and chose reform over retribution. The fence I destroyed, and then rebuilt, stands as a reminder of all of it. Every time I see it, I remember that change is possible, that standing up to abuse is worth it, and that sometimes the most unlikely actions can lead to the most important outcomes. If I could go back and do it differently, would I? Honestly, I do not know. The rational part of me says yes, I should have handled it through legal channels from the start. But the part of me that remembers the frustration and helplessness of being fined into oblivion for trying to make a living says maybe not. Maybe that dramatic action was exactly what was needed to expose the rot and force change. What I do know is that I sleep better at night now. Not just because I am not worried about violation notices anymore, but because I know that I stood up for myself and others. I know that I refused to be pushed around. I know that when faced with injustice, I did not just accept it. And in the end, is not that what matters most? Not whether we make perfect decisions, but whether we have the courage to stand up for what is right, even when it is hard, even when it is scary, even when it might cost us everything. The sun was setting over Willow Creek as I finished my work for the day and headed home. Bear was waiting at the door, tail wagging, ready for his evening walk. We walked through the neighborhood together, past houses and yards that were now maintained out of pride rather than fear, past the community park where children were playing, past the fence that had been broken and rebuilt. And I realized that sometimes, just sometimes, things work out exactly the way they are supposed to. Even when the path is messy and chaotic and involves a backhoe crashing through a fence, especially then.